Boldwood presents Wartime Arrivals at Harbour House, written by Fenella J Miller and read by Laura Kerman. Chapter 1. London, July 1939. Mrs. Elizabeth Roby frowned and checked her gold wristwatch. Nanny should have brought the children back from school by now, and George and Emily ought to be in the nursery eating tea. Jonathon, her husband, had had the bells to summon the staff removed when they'd moved in 5 years ago. But it was such a bother having to go and find someone when just by pulling the bell strap she could have remained where she was and had a servant come to her. Then she heard the children walking past the drawing-room window on the pavement outside. George was laughing and Emily, as always, was telling him to calm down. "Mummy doesn't like you to be noisy, George. We don't want to make her cross now, do we?" Her son replied with a snort. "You don't want to make her cross. You're a goody-goody, but I don't care. Daddy likes us to laugh. Why has he been away so long this time?" Emily's reply was muffled as the children were now approaching the front door. Elizabeth also wondered why Jonathon was still absent. Being an Admiralty surveyor and working at both Chatham and Greenwich dockyards inspecting boats meant he was frequently away, but not usually for more than a night or two. This time he'd been away almost a week, and she thought it most impolite of him not to have telephoned and told her why he'd been delayed. She didn't enter the hall to greet her children. That wasn't her way. As far as she was concerned, children should spend the majority of their time with their nanny in the nursery and only come down to spend time with their parents in the evening for an hour or two when it was convenient. Mamma had warned her not to marry for love. Marrying somebody so different from herself, however handsome and intelligent, could only lead to unhappiness. Unfortunately, her mother's warnings had proved painfully accurate. Both children should be at boarding school, not attending a small private school in Kensington. However, Jonathon wouldn't hear of it, and so the children remained, getting bigger and noisier and allowing her no time to herself. She loved them both, of course she did, but her own formal upbringing made it difficult for her to show her feelings. How she wished she was as relaxed and easygoing as Jonathon. He and the children had so much fun together, and she always felt excluded from this. She smiled sadly. It was a mystery to her why he'd been so eager to marry her when he seemed to disapprove of almost everything she stood for. They'd met at a ball 12 years ago, and once she'd seen him, no one else would do. He was a little over 6 foot, broad-shouldered and devastatingly attractive. Being so tall, he'd been easy to see above those milling about in the ballroom. He had mid-brown, wavy hair, steel-grey eyes, and a smile that had captivated her from the first moment she'd seen him. Despite coming from a middle-class home, he had all the attributes of someone from her own background. He won a scholarship to a decent public school, and from there, another one to study at Oxford. He could ride, played rugby and cricket, and was a superb dancer. The only thing he didn't do was shoot or hunt. By the time she realised he really wasn't suitable, she was hopelessly in love with him. Papa, who obviously decided this sort of thing, liked Jonathon. So when her future husband asked Papa's permission to propose, he'd agreed. Elizabeth wandered about the elegant drawing-room, patting cushions and straightening chairs. She was bored. Even though she thought she might have fallen out of love with Jonathon, life was so much more interesting when he was home. Certainly she missed his company at night. She had no complaints about his performance in bed. She was roused from her reverie by the sound of the front door slamming. Jonathon was home at last. She wanted to dash into the hall and throw herself into his arms, tell him how much she missed him. But that wasn't how she'd been taught to behave, so she remained where she was. "I'm in here, my dear. Won't you come and explain why you've been away so long this time?" He strode through the door and snatched her from her feet. Her hands automatically encircled his neck, and a highly delightful and satisfying few minutes later, he slid her overheated body down his chest and returned her feet to the carpet. "Where are the children? I want to tell them my news as it includes them." "Having tea in the nursery. Where else would they be at 5 o'clock? His eyes flashed and his mouth tightened for a second. Then he nodded and put his head around the drawing-room door and yelled up the stairs. "George! Emily! I'm back, and I've got the most exciting news. Come down here and I'll tell you what it is. Your tea can wait." Elizabeth shuddered. "I wish you wouldn't yell, my dear. It sets a bad example to the children." He ignored her and moved into the hall. Seconds later, the sound of pounding, childish feet echoed throughout the house. There were squeals of delight, and Elizabeth moved slightly so she could watch him stoop down and pick his son and daughter up, as if they weighed no more than a bag of feathers, and hold them tight. "I've missed you two scallywags. I hope you've not been too noisy in upsetting your mother." "We've been at school every day, silly Daddy, so there's been no time to upset her," George said brightly. He might be only 8 years old, but he was already showing signs of his father's strong character and had a distressing tendency to misbehave. Jonathon didn't believe in any form of physical punishment. The worst the child ever received was a stern telling off. Everett, Elizabeth's own brother, had been regularly beaten for his misdemeanours, and even she had been soundly spanked on more than one occasion. It had done them no harm, and she was confident that strict discipline moulded children into more responsible adults. Jonathon hadn't been beaten, and he was a far nicer person than she was. Jonathon crushed his beloved children to his chest and thanked God that he had them. Without these two, his marriage would be a miserable affair. He glanced up and saw that Elizabeth was watching them. Her face and figure still as lovely as they had been when he'd met her 12 years ago. It was on the inside that his wife had changed from the happy, loving, lively girl he'd thought he'd married into a disappointing replica of her mother. She'd been staying with family friends in Oxford, been surrounded by gay young Debs, and he hadn't understood initially that she was just copying their behaviour. Her mood swings from vivacious and fun to formal had intrigued him, and he'd thought she'd settled down once they were married. His mum had warned him he was making a mistake, that he was blinded by Elizabeth's golden hair and cornflower blue eyes, that a girl from that sort of upper-crust background would never settle for what he was offering once the stardust settled. How right she'd been. But he wasn't about to give up without a fight. Whatever Elizabeth's feelings for him were, he still loved her, doubted he'd ever love anyone else, and was determined to try to resurrect their dying marriage. Emily, 2 years older than her brother, was worryingly quiet, a nervous little girl who spent all her time trying to please her mother. Jonathon sincerely believed that Elizabeth did love her children, but her appalling upbringing made it almost impossible for her to show this. She had no genuine friends, just acquaintances from similar families to hers. "Come along, little ones. I've got the most exciting news for you and your mummy. First, I must tell you something very serious." Emily pressed closer to him, and George looked up, wide-eyed and eager to hear whatever the news might be. Elizabeth was now seated, ankles crossed and her hands neatly in her lap. She should sprawl in a chair sometimes, relax a little bit, and not sit like a stuffed dummy in her own front room, or drawing room, as she insisted it was called. He took the long, comfortable sofa, and the children settled in on either side of him. They knew better than to attempt to sit close to their mother. "You know we've talked about the fact that we're about to go to war with Germany, that London won't be safe for women and children." George grabbed his hand. "We do know that, Daddy. Miss Shilton told us, and we had to try on horrible gas masks. Are we going to be evacuated?" Before Jonathon could reply, Elizabeth interrupted. "Of course not. We'll go and stay in the country with your grandparents." That won't be happening, Elizabeth, as you very well know. We've already discussed this at length. However, the reason I've been away so long is because I've been making arrangements for us to move to a delightful riverside village called Wivenhoe on the River Colne. Elizabeth looked appalled and was about to make her feelings clear, but he shook his head. No, I am the head of this household, and I've already discussed this with your father, and he agrees that the family should stay together. He hated to be so harsh. Her eyes filled and her knuckles whitened as she gripped her hands together. I'm transferring to be the senior Admiralty surveyor for the Colne Valley shipyards. I'll be based in Wivenhoe, where I'll mainly be working, but I'll eventually have 2 subordinates who will travel across the river to the village opposite, Rowhedge, and down the river to Brightlingsea, where ships are also going to be built. The children were as excited as he'd hoped they would be, and he spent the next hour answering their eager questions. The children were as excited as he'd hoped they would be, and he spent the next hour answering their eager questions. He was disappointed that his wife had walked out just a few minutes after he'd made his big announcement. It didn't matter where she hid. He'd find her after the children were safely asleep and make it absolutely clear that she had no choice. She would be coming to Wivenhoe and not going to live in the stately home in Surrey that she'd grown up in. Eventually, the house was quiet. He'd eaten dinner in solitary splendour in the dining room as Elizabeth hadn't reappeared. When he'd gone up with the children, he'd quickly looked into the marital bedroom, but she wasn't there. God knows where she was, but he wasn't going to bed until they'd had the difficult conversation. He'd managed to find a decent house in Wivenhoe called Harbour House, but it only had a front garden and a small rear yard, no grounds at all. There were 4 good-sized bedrooms, 2 reception rooms, a kitchen, dining room, and scullery. The house had an indoor WC but no bathroom. There would be no nanny, no nursemaid or maid living in. In future, Elizabeth would have to take over the reins of the house and look after the children herself. Her personal maid wouldn't be accompanying them, and he thought that might be the thing she'd object to the most. His wife had never lifted a finger, had always had servants to do everything for her, and was going to find it difficult. But she was intelligent, tougher than she realised to have survived her childhood, and he had faith in her ability to adapt. This was a make-or-break situation. Either she'd become the woman he knew she could be, or she'd leave him. She wouldn't be taking his children away from him, and he was gambling on the fact that although she didn't show it, she actually loved them as much as he did. He'd already arranged for a daily cleaner, a cook-cum-housekeeper, and someone to do the heavy work, so she'd still be far better off than most of those she'd be mixing with. This house was on the left-hand side of a little lane called Alma Street. Opposite was Station Road, and the High Street ran by the front gate. The main drawback was that the railway ran alongside in a deep cutting, and any washing hung out would be soot-covered, as no doubt would the children if they played in the front garden. On the other corner stood Little Wick, where the resident doctor resided with his wife and young family, a girl of about 5 and a baby boy. It was a shame they weren't a bit older, as they could have been companions for his 2. Wivenhoe appeared to be divided into down-streeters and up-streeters, and unfortunately, Harbour House was surrounded by overcrowded Victorian terraces, so was in the heart of the down or poorer area. There used to be a boys' school halfway up the hill, but that had closed in 1938. Therefore, George would go with Emily to the village school, literally a stone's throw away on the other side of the railway. It would do her good to mix with ordinary children, learn to play, to laugh and enjoy herself, and not creep around like a shadow. Eventually, Jonathon discovered his errant wife in the summer house at the end of the garden. The sun had set, and Elizabeth was no more than a vague outline in the gloom. "Talk here, or we can go inside, but we are going to talk," he said firmly. "I don't want to talk to you. I'm not going with you, and neither are the children. I'm going to send them away to school, where they'll be safe." Jonathon sighed. This was going to be a long evening. "We both know you can't do that, Elizabeth, so let's not argue about this. The removal company I've employed will be here the day after tomorrow to pack. I'm handing the house over to the Admiralty for the duration. It'll be put to good use, housing naval officers and so on." "I'm not coming with you. You can kidnap my children, but you can't drag me into the car." He chuckled, and this didn't improve the situation. "Sweetheart, accept the inevitable with good grace. Even if I'd allow it, you can't go to your parents, as they've already left for America. Your ancestral home is, at this very moment, being turned into a military hospital of some sort." She swallowed and sniffed. She was crying. She never showed her emotions, and his irritation evaporated. He turned and gently picked her up, surprised that she didn't protest. "Come on, let's go in. It'll be dark soon." She pressed her face against his shoulder but said nothing. He shouldered his way through the French doors at the garden end of the drawing room and headed for the stairs. He didn't ask if she wanted to sleep in one of the guest rooms, but carried her into their bedroom and put her down. He half expected her to push past him and vanish again, but instead she leaned against him and cried in earnest. "Please don't cry, darling. It'll just give you a headache. I love you. We'll make this work. You never know, you might actually enjoy living in the country, mixing with ordinary families, having more to do with the children." Suddenly she stiffened and shoved him away. "Is that your roundabout way of telling me that Nanny and the nursemaid won't be coming with us?" "Of course they won't. Nanny has already found another position, and Mary's going to join one of the women's services as soon as they're taking new recruits." The curtains, as always, had already been closed by the live-in maid, and he strolled across and turned on the central light. The tears were already drying on her cheeks, and she'd changed from despair to fury. She'd always been mercurial emotionally, and it was one of the things that he loved about her. "What about a housekeeper, cook, any kind of staff at all? I suppose you're expecting me to get down on my hands and knees and scrub the kitchen floor." "Don't be ridiculous, Elizabeth. You'll have plenty of domestic help, but the children will be your responsibility. They'll be at school during the day, obviously, but evenings, weekends, and holidays, they'll be under your care." "The holidays? I can't possibly be in charge of them for weeks on end." "I'm sure you'll manage. The children there tend to look after themselves during daylight hours. The place is surrounded by countryside and the river." At the mention of water, she collapsed on the bed. "They can't swim. They'll drown, and it'll be your fault." "I'll teach them to swim, to ride a bike, and how to behave around farm animals. They need to know the difference between a bull and a cow for a start." He said this confidently, but they both knew it was unlikely to happen. He'd be too busy. To his astonishment, instead of continuing the argument, she grabbed a pillow from the bed and threw it at him. He caught it easily, but before he could put it down, she began to bombard him with the items from the bedside table nearest to her. The book he'd been reading hit him square in the face, and it was no longer amusing. He tossed the items he'd been catching to one side, and in 2 steps he was beside her. There was no reasoning with her when she was like this, but one thing always worked. Instead of remonstrating, he tumbled her backwards onto the bed and pinned her arms one on either side of her head. She glared up at him, and he smiled. She didn't struggle as he leaned down and kissed her passionately. She responded with equal enthusiasm. Things might be very wrong with much of their marriage, but their love life was spectacular. A considerable time later, they were lying naked, limbs entwined, both entirely satisfied. "I didn't have any dinner, Jonathon. Do you think there's anything in the kitchen?" He chuckled and kissed her. "I'm quite certain there is, my darling, and I'll go down and find us some supper." He was halfway across the room when she laughed, not something she did very often. and it warmed his heart to hear her. "If you go down in your birthday suit, you'll give cook a fit of the vapours." "A fit of the what?" "She's leaving at the end of the week, so I don't suppose it matters." He'd no intention of wandering about the house unclothed, not because of the staff, but because of his children, but he didn't tell his wife that. He heard her scramble from the bed, and then his silk dressing gown was shoved into his hands. "Thank you, my darling. How kind you are to cover my embarrassment. If you don't do the same for yourself, I might never get downstairs." "Go away, you horrible man. Get me something to eat. If my supper's acceptable, then I might not insist on falling asleep immediately afterwards." Chapter 2. Elizabeth scampered to the ruined bed and hastily straightened the sheets. This was one area of the marriage that her mother had got totally wrong. Making love with Jonathon was what kept her going when everything else seemed grey and depressing. Her mother had called marital relations a chore to be endured until one's family was complete. She slipped on her flimsy nightgown, not wishing to be without it when he returned with their supper. If only they could spend their entire life in bed, then she wouldn't be miserable most of the time. The thought of leaving London didn't appall her as much as the fact that she would no longer have live-in servants, and especially that the children would be entirely her responsibility. Emily was no trouble. She was well behaved and reminded Elizabeth of herself at that age. But George was headstrong and disobedient, and if she wasn't allowed to discipline him, then he'd be out of control in no time. Thinking about the future, not only the changes for her, but for the country if Britain went to war with Germany, as Jonathon insisted it would, wasn't pleasant. If she was being absolutely honest, leaving London wouldn't be a hardship. Things were already changing. People she knew had left either for the country or for America, like her parents. Everett was something in the city, a stockbroker, she thought. They'd met a few weeks ago for lunch at the Savoy, and she'd been quite shocked about his views on Hitler. He almost seemed to approve of the horrible little man. She had a nasty suspicion that her brother might be a Mosley supporter, a fascist, and had no intention of seeing him again if she could help it. Moving to this Wivenhoe place would make that simpler. She wondered if her brother's political views were why Mamma and Papa had decided to relocate to America. The rattle of crockery approaching the bedroom made her sit up and push these unpleasant thoughts aside. Her stomach grumbled. When she'd said she was hungry, that had been no exaggeration. Jonathon put the tray in the centre of the bed and then folded his long, lean length onto a spindly gold-painted chair. It creaked ominously, and he grinned. "Perhaps not the best choice, but I'm sure it'll hold me for a bit." He gestured at the tray, which was covered by a crisply ironed tea towel. Like a conjurer with a magic trick, he flicked it off, revealing the contents. Her mouth watered at the delights he'd discovered. "Everything I love. Thank you so much. I don't suppose when the war starts we'll be able to get such delicious treats. I think I'm going to miss coffee the most. I think it highly unlikely the shops in Wivenhoe have heard of half these things. There's an excellent general store just across the road from the house we're going to be living in. You'll be able to get everything you need, if not from there, then from one of the bakers and the butchers." "Will I have to do the shopping myself? You said I'll have a cook. Won't she want to do that herself?" "God knows. I'm leaving the domestic side of things to you. Although none of the staff live in, the house isn't big enough for that. You won't have to do anything too arduous. You might actually enjoy taking care of the weekly shop." She choked on a piece of toast and pâté. He patted her vigorously on the back, and when she'd recovered, she fixed him with her fiercest look. He grinned and carried on eating. "What could possibly have given you the idea that someone like me could enjoy doing something as mundane as buying groceries?" Unabashed, he selected another scone and slathered it with butter and homemade strawberry jam. Even if you think doing it's beneath you, I'm quite certain our children will relish the chance to experience what ordinary children take for granted. Another thing, you said you were going to teach them to ride a bike. I wasn't aware that our children owned bicycles. They don't, but they do now. Extravagantly purchased yesterday from Harrods. I was tempted to buy one for you, but thought that might be taking things a little far. Will we still have our car? For a while, but petrol will be rationed like everything else when war's declared. Look, darling, I know this is a shock, but I promise you'll not regret it. Try and imagine a world where the children can go out and get muddy, where you don't have to spend an hour putting on your makeup and doing your hair before you leave the house. She closed her eyes for a moment and thought about it. She liked absolutely nothing about any of this. I suppose you expect me to wear metal curlers and a headscarf so that I fit in? It was his turn to choke, but she offered him no assistance. He sprayed the bed with crumbs, but for some reason this didn't bother her tonight. Normally it would have done so. Was the fact that her mother was no longer able to appear on the doorstep and criticize everything that Elizabeth did the reason she was feeling more relaxed? I don't know how to talk to ordinary people. I've never mixed with them. How am I going to make any friends? You don't have any friends now, darling. Only acquaintances. It's a fresh start for all of us. Why don't we get a dog for the children? I think not. I'm going to have enough to do keeping track of Emily and George without a four-legged addition to the family. He drained the last of the coffee, gathered up the remnants of the feast, and removed the tray. Something I forgot to mention, sweetheart, is that the house comes with a magnificent ginger Tom. He gave her no time to complain. He pulled her close, his heart was pounding, and his lips were pressed on her own. She forgot her reservations and surrendered to his joyous lovemaking again. It was only as she fell asleep that it occurred to her that he hadn't used a prophylactic. She sent up a fervent prayer to the Almighty that the cat would be the only addition to their family. She really hadn't enjoyed being pregnant, and 2 children were more than enough. Jonathon slept better than he had for weeks and woke up delighted to find that his wife was still beside him. He hoped this meant she'd accepted the inevitable changes that were coming and was ready to embrace something new. He slid out of bed, collected his dressing gown, and headed for the bathroom. They were fortunate to have not only a bath, but also a shower, which he preferred. Elizabeth wasn't the only one going to find the primitive plumbing arrangements at their new home difficult. The children had a WC and washroom on the nursery floor, and only came down to use this bathroom for their weekly bath. There was a WC in the basement for the staff, and he'd given them permission to use the bath or shower when the family was out. This had horrified his wife, but he'd overruled her objections. At the moment, she had her own dressing room, as did he. Hers was a converted box room, his little more than a large closet. He smiled ruefully. They wouldn't have that luxury either in Wivenhoe. There would be a spare bedroom, and Elizabeth would have to use that. By the time he was dressed, she was moving about, and he walked into the bedroom intending to tell her that he had the week free and could help with the removal arrangements. The happy, loving woman of last night was gone and replaced by the painfully familiar termagant. I suppose you think that what happened last night will have changed my mind. It hasn't. My brother has a large apartment somewhere in Mayfair. I'm going to live with him. His hands clenched. He swallowed, took a steadying breath, not wishing to lose his temper. Please, Elizabeth, we've been through this. You don't even like your brother. He's a fascist, and I'm quite sure he doesn't want you under his feet. In which case, I shall go and stay with my Aunt Charlotte in Hampshire. There's no need to glare at me, Jonathon. My mind's made up. You're coming to Wivenhoe with me and the children. We both know that's going to happen, so why make life difficult for all of us with this nonsense? Instead of arguing, as she usually did, she shrugged. We'll see. You might think you hold all the cards, but you forget that I have a private income. I'm not dependent on you financially, and intend to make my own arrangements. And you've forgotten that your trust fund was transferred to the children 2 years ago." She recoiled as if he'd slapped her. Her face twisted, and the look she gave him could have curdled milk. "I hate you. I should have listened to my mother and not married you. I see now that I don't have a choice, that I have to come whether I want to or not, but be warned. If I can see a way out of this monstrous marriage, then I shall take it. I can't stop you leaving, but you'll be penniless and the children will remain with me. Is that really what you want?" "What I want is to be free from you, and I always get what I want in the end." Somehow he managed to hold back his bitter reply and left her to get dressed. Much as he loved her, there were times, and this was one of them, when he too wished he'd never married her. He was halfway down the stairs when he swore and punched the wall. His actions terrified the maid crossing the hall, who dropped the tray of cutlery she was carrying, and it clattered to the floor. The poor girl burst into tears and threw her apron over her head as if hoping she'd be invisible. Jonathon put aside his horror that in his fury with his wife, he'd ignored the existence of others in his house. He jumped down the remaining steps and patted the shivering maid on the shoulder. "It wasn't your fault, Daisy. I startled you. Don't cry. Let's pick this up together. Cook will never know, and neither will Mrs. Roby." She emerged from behind her apron and with a watery smile dropped to her knees, and together they cleared up the scattered knives and forks. As soon as she had them back on the tray, she vanished to the dining room. An icy voice spoke from the landing. "It's a good thing that stupid girl is leaving my employ, as I would have dismissed her for behaving as she did. I'm sure you would have wanted to, Elizabeth, but I wouldn't have allowed it. Why, in God's name, do you continue with this charade? We'd all be so much happier if you'd just get on with things and be thankful for what you've got and not fantasize about a different life." Fortunately for them both, the children emerged from the door that led upstairs to the nursery floor. This was unusual, as they always remained in their own domain unless sent for. "Daddy!" George yelled. "Nanny and Mary said they aren't looking after us anymore. They're leaving for their new positions this morning. Does that mean we don't have to go to school?" They were still in their nightclothes, which was also unheard of. "You'll be leaving there in 2 days anyway, so I don't suppose it makes any difference. Go and get dressed. I suppose you're capable of doing that for yourselves?" Emily nodded. "Of course we can, Daddy. Shall we come down to the dining room for our breakfast?" "Yes. You'll eat with us in future. It's how it'll be in Wivenhoe, so you might as well get used to it now." They ran off, and he could hear them chattering. At least his children were unfazed by this change in their circumstances, and he thought they might even be as excited as he was. Elizabeth stalked past him without comment. Was she upset that the children hadn't spoke to her, or still angry with him because of the row they'd just had? Elizabeth ignored going into the dining room and headed out into the garden, to her sanctuary, the little summer house at the far end. Here she could sit and listen to the birds, watch the butterflies, and for a brief moment forget she was trapped in somebody else's life. If only she'd listened to her mother and not her father, she wouldn't be in this position. She should be married to somebody like her, maybe even someone with a title, with nothing to do but be the perfect wife and hold elegant soirees and attend house parties in the summer. Instead, she was trapped, married to a man she didn't understand and who didn't understand her. Jonathon expected her to be like him, to enjoy a challenge, to not worry about what other people thought. But she couldn't live up to his expectations. How was she going to manage without the support of a nanny and housekeeper? At least she'd have someone to cook, as she didn't even know how to boil an egg successfully. The real problem was the children. The long summer holidays stretched ahead, and she hadn't the faintest idea how she was going to entertain them. She sighed and closed her eyes. Jonathon had said they would live in the middle of this small town, or was it a village? But it was surrounded by countryside, farmland, and so on. And she thought that perhaps she might actually like walking along a country lane with Emily and George. It didn't matter how she felt. She had to go with her husband and children. Perhaps Jonathon had been right when he'd told her to stop fussing and get on with it. She'd pushed herself to her feet like an old woman, not someone who'd just celebrated her 30th birthday. She arrived in the dining room at the same time as the children, who looked remarkably tidy considering they'd had to dress themselves. "Good. I'm absolutely starving. I thought I might have missed breakfast." "Of course you haven't. We were waiting for you," Jonathon said solemnly when they both knew it was untrue. "Thank you. I was thinking, my dear, that we really can't take the large items of furniture with us. There are certainly some things that I'll be happy to leave behind. What about you?" "I'm letting this house furnished, so we can't take everything even if we wanted to. To be honest, I've not really thought about it, but you're right. Why don't we spend the day deciding what we want and what we don't want? Children, you'd better do the same upstairs." "Can we take our toys?" George asked anxiously. "Yes. You've both got a decent-sized room, so there'll be plenty of space." Emily, who didn't normally participate in family conversations, raised her hand as if she needed to get permission to speak. "What is it, sweetheart?" Jonathon immediately asked. "I don't think we need the rocking horse or the baby things. We've both grown out of those." "Leave anything you don't want where it is, Emily. I'm quite sure that naval officers won't wish to venture into the nursery," Elizabeth said, confident that this was something Jonathon wouldn't contradict. "I can hear the trolley coming with our breakfast, Daddy," George said loudly. "Sir told us that when the war starts, there'll be something called rationing, and we won't be able to have what we want for breakfast." "That's right, son, but I'm sure we won't starve." Elizabeth spent a relatively enjoyable day with her family, but was relieved when Jonathon offered to put the children to bed. "They need a bath. I'll see to that. You look exhausted. Why don't you settle down in the drawing room and put on the evening concert? I told Cook to serve something on a tray in there later. I hope that's all right with you." She nodded. "Yes, I'm still full from lunch, so something light will be perfect. Had no idea how much food our children consumed at a meal. Somehow I thought that George would eat more than his sister, being a boy, but Emily ate more than me. I do hope she's not going to become plump." "She's growing, Elizabeth. I expect she needs more fuel at the moment than she would normally want. I noticed her frock was too short and rather tight." He grinned at her look of horror. "Don't worry, I don't expect you to take up sewing. I'm hoping we can find somebody who can make whatever she needs. There's a trunk full of lengths of material that I was given by an old uncle, and I've never used. I'm not exactly sure what's in there, but there must be something that will be suitable for a girl her age. We've not looked in the attic. Shall we do that tomorrow? George said he'd never been up there and thought it would be an adventure. What do you think?" She smiled. "I think it will be dusty, full of cobwebs, and extremely unpleasant. However, I survived today, so I think I can manage tomorrow without too much difficulty." Jonathon collected the children. George had been rampaging around the house and making far too much noise whilst Emily had sat quietly reading. He left Elizabeth in blissful peace to listen to the early evening concert. Today hadn't been as frightful as she'd expected. She was pleasantly tired, and for the first time thought that her day hadn't been entirely wasted. Chapter 3. Jonathon was disappointed but unsurprised that Elizabeth had decided to sleep in the spare room that night. Probably for the best, as more often than not, after a passionate night, she reverted to being a facsimile of her appalling mother as she had done today. He settled down in bed to read a crime story written by an American author, Raymond Chandler, that had been given to him as a leaving gift by one of his chums. He'd scarcely read the opening page when there was a tap on the door so soft He'd thought he'd imagined it. "Come in, it's not locked." Slowly the door opened and Elizabeth appeared in the gap, but didn't venture any further. "I just want to say that I enjoyed today, and I'm going to really try to be happy about this move." He wanted to leap out of bed and go to her, but something told him that would be the wrong thing to do. "Thank you, darling. I hope you know how happy that's made me. I know we could have waited until war's actually been declared before moving, but I thought it would be better to be settled. I understand. I thought if we investigated the attics in the morning, perhaps we could take a picnic to the park in the afternoon." "I'd love that. I'm sure the children will too." "We don't do nearly enough as a family. Good night, Jonathon." The door closed as quietly as it had opened, leaving him with more questions than answers. What had prompted her to come to him? Had she genuinely changed her mind, or was she just pretending to have accepted what was happening to make life easier for all of them? He retrieved his book from the floor where it had fallen when he'd sat up so abruptly. The reasons behind her decision didn't matter as long as she was now going to cooperate. He'd been prepared to put her in the car, kicking and screaming if necessary, and was relieved they could leave in some semblance of order on Friday. They had an entertaining morning, rummaging about in the attics, and even Elizabeth agreed it had been worth it, as they'd uncovered some treasures. Jonathon had made a dozen journeys up and down the narrow staircase, ably assisted by the children, who thought the whole thing a lark. The things they'd found and that they wanted to take with them were now piled haphazardly in the centre of the spare room. This had been his suggestion, and although not done deliberately to prevent Elizabeth from sleeping there again, he was pleased she'd be joining him this evening. "Look at this, Daddy," George said, and held up a velvet box full of beautifully carved miniature figures, animals and houses. "I think it's a great find, son, and it must be 50 years old at least. Have you got something you particularly like, Emily?" His daughter was as grubby as her brother, her lovely corn-coloured hair, a match for her mother's, mired with cobwebs and dust. However, he'd never seen her look so happy. "I certainly have. Look, Daddy and Mummy, isn't she exquisite? Do you think if I'm very careful, I can comb her hair and wash her face and make her look even more beautiful?" The doll she was clutching had a porcelain face, blue eyes that opened and shut, and lustrous golden hair. Exactly his daughter and wife's colouring, so small wonder the little girl was so happy with her find. Elizabeth knelt down beside her daughter. "I'm sure we can restore her appearance. I found someone who can be her companion. What do you think?" She held out a slightly smaller but equally pretty doll, but this one had darker hair and brown eyes. Both were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, which were probably the originals. Emily squealed, grabbed the doll, and then threw herself into Elizabeth's arms. For a horrible second, he thought his wife would recoil as she avoided any sort of physical contact with her children as a rule. Instead, after a slight hesitation, she returned the embrace with equal enthusiasm. George scrambled onto Jonathon's lap, clutching his box. "What about you, Daddy? Didn't you find any treasure?" He hugged the little boy and ruffled his hair. "Actually, young man, I did." He pointed to the higgledy-piggledy pile of items on the bed. "Can you guess which of the things on there it is?" Jonathon shook his head when both his children tried to stand up. "No, you've got to look from where you are. You too, Elizabeth, see if you can guess. You've got the better view as you're tallest." This game entertained the children for some time, and even Elizabeth joined in, although with not quite as much enthusiasm as they did. Eventually, he decided to show them. "Look, my treasure is in that tin. Which of you is going to open it?" George didn't wait for permission, but threw himself onto the bed and snatched it up. He wrenched open the lid and tipped out the contents. "What are these?" "I don't like your treasure, Daddy. It's not as good as mine." Emily picked up one of the items with reverence. "I know what these are.
They're medals, aren't they, Daddy? George, these are real treasures. They were given to brave men who fought in a war.
Well done, Emily. What an intelligent girl you are. Who won those medals, Daddy? George asked. I've no idea. They're on the shelf in the attic. They must have belonged to someone who lived here before us. I'm going to find out who it was when I have time. Could you put them back in the tin for me, please? We've still not heard what your mother has chosen. He hoped that Elizabeth had actually found something she liked enough to share her choice with the rest of them. It's that large brass trunk that we struggled to bring down the stairs. Emily, why don't you open it? You have to undo the leather straps and then slide across the catch at the front. George tried to push his sister out of the way, but Jonathon reached down and picked him up. No, your sister was asked to do it. Behave yourself, young man. His son might be a rascal, but he immediately calmed down, knowing that he'd be in serious trouble if he didn't. As expected, the trunk was full of exotic materials, from India, Jonathon thought, and a kaleidoscope of colour was soon draped over the lid of the trunk and spilling onto the floor. There's more than enough in here to make you several dresses, Emily, and even some for me. George wriggled in his grip. What about me and Daddy? There's some fine cotton that will make excellent shirts for you both. Elizabeth smiled up at Jonathon. All I need to do is find a dressmaker when we move. I think there will probably be scraps that can be made into outfits for your new dolls too, Emily. He left his wife and daughter to carefully pack the material back into the trunk, whilst he escorted his son to the nursery floor, where he could wash